And there is something called the Groves Memo, which is the blueprint for depleted uranium weapons. And basically they said, well, we don't know if the bombs will work, but uranium burns at temperatures that are hotter than the sun. It forms a radioactive poison gas that contaminates the air, the water, the blood, the food, the soil of a region. And if we can't get atomic bombs to work, we can use dirty bombs, dirty missiles, and dirty bullets. But the only problem was, in the memo, they said there's no way to make any protective clothing against it. It goes through all air filters and all gas masks, through all protective clothing, and it still does today. And there's no way to avoid contaminating your own troops. So it was deemed to be too horrific a weapon to use in World War II, so they kind of put it on the shelf. And they also developed Agent Orange, or the prototype for Agent Orange, a hormone that would defoliate trees and starve a population to death. So the three most horrific and environmentally damaging weapon systems in the history of militarism were developed under the Manhattan Project in World War II. And the first depleted uranium weapons system that we found in patent office records was 1968, when a Gatling gun type weapon system was developed for the Navy to use on their ships to shoot down incoming missiles or planes. And by 1973, which coincided with the oil embargo, depleted uranium had been developed into weapon systems, and it was turned over by the U.S. government to Israel to be used under U.S. supervision in the Yom Kippur War in the Golan Heights of Israel, and it wiped out the Arab and Egyptian tanks. So they immediately went into full-blown development of depleted uranium weapon systems, and these correlated with oil. And the first one was developed by the Howard Hughes Corporation, the Phalanx system for the Navy, and that was tested in 1974, and within 4 months it was sold to all branches of the U.S. military in 12 countries. No countries have used it except Britain and the U.S. in Gulf War I beginning in 1991. In Yugoslavia, the NATO attack in 1998 on Yugoslavia, in Afghanistan in 2001, and then we gave Israel something like 5,000 depleted uranium bunker busters to use on Lebanon in their attack in July of 2006. And what we've discovered is that those bomb craters in Lebanon were tested at the Harwell Radiation Laboratory in England by Dr. Chris Busby, and they were found to have deuterium, very high levels of uranium-235 that should not have been there, and evidence of neutron activation from the fast neutrons in some kind of a fourth-generation nuclear device that was hidden in the depleted uranium bunker busters. So basically, Israel nuked itself, and they have an epidemic. They had an epidemic of diabetes by December, just 6 months later. And just nuclear technologies, you can't use them without nuking yourself. They just don't work. And so 1991 is when depleted uranium was introduced to the battlefield for the first time. And since 1991, under George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton, and now George Bush Jr., at least the equivalent of 800,000 Nagasaki bombs have been released through the use of depleted uranium weapons into the atmosphere, and only 40,000 Hiroshima bombs equivalent radiation was released during all of atmospheric testing. So They have completely turned the whole global atmosphere into the Auschwitz radioactive poison gas chamber, and there are about 2 atoms of uranium in every cubic meter of air now globally.
As I understand it, the half-life of depleted uranium is on the order of 4.5 billion years. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Which, and of course, that's about the age of the Earth.
That's the age of the Earth, and it takes 10 half-lives for radiation to diminish to an insignificant amount. Our universe is only about 16 billion years old, and it's going to take 45 billion years for the Earth to get unradioactive.
One must ask, well, of course, you have documented the tremendous effects, the many different kinds of effects from exposure to DU in our soldiers, in the population of Iraq, Yugoslavia, etc. Could you just briefly explain what happens to people and other creatures who are exposed?
Yes, it's affecting all living things, plants, bacteria, the fish in the ocean, mammals, humans, everyone, the birds. And basically, when these weapons burn, a bunker buster is dropped and the uranium shatters into lots of pieces and it burns. It looks like fireworks, and you can see in live media footage of, for instance, the war in Baghdad, that they were using depleted uranium bombs because they look like fireworks. All these sparklers of burning pieces of uranium go flying out all over the place. And that radioactive poison gas gets up into air masses and air movements and into the troposphere up to about 10,000 feet, which is the most energetic part of the atmosphere, and it's where the storm fronts and hurricanes and rainstorms rain out almost all of the depleted uranium within 2 months. And these huge hurricanes that hit the east coast of the United States originate in North Africa in the Sahara Desert, and they're loaded with uranium from our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Yugoslavia and now Lebanon, and it's carried across the Atlantic Ocean and is rained out along the Gulf Coast states. We have the highest diabetes increases in the United States since 1991 in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. This is the depleted uranium effects from the wars over there in distant countries. And Dr. Busby was able to get air monitoring data. I mean, I predicted all of this because my background is in atmospheric dust. And sure enough, Dr. Busby was able to use the Freedom of Information Act request to get the air monitoring data from the Atomic Weapons Facility in England at Aldermaston. And oh my God, the depleted uranium they were measuring during the 2001 Afghanistan attack and 2003, the attack on Iraq, was so high, the DU concentration was so high in England that it was required to be reported to the British government. And Dr. Busby actually calculated that any man living within 100 miles of that air monitoring facility would inhale 23 million particles of depleted uranium in 2 weeks. It is so tiny, it's nanoparticles. They are little round, hollow balls like Christmas tree balls of uranium high-temperature oxides. And they go, 70% of what goes into your lungs goes right through the blood-lung barrier into the blood, and these tiny particles are carried in the cholesterol or the lipids right into the cells. Uranium is actually, the target organ is the brain. So it does devastating damage to the brain, to the neuromuscular system, to the digestive system, to the heart. Basically, it trashes the body. and that's what Gulf War syndrome is. And in reality, the whole global population has Gulf War syndrome now.
Well, now I can certainly see how depleted uranium radioactive material would cause genetic mutations, birth defects. What's the connection with diabetes?
Well, what I sort of heard from people that I was interviewing who went to Baghdad after the 2003 war. One was an American wife who was married to an Iraqi American young man. He was in his 30s, and he wanted to go and see his family after the 2003 Iraq. So she went with him, and she only stayed about a week and came back to Chicago. He stayed 3 weeks and came back, and she called me because she said, my husband was only there 3 weeks, and he's been back 2 months, and he has diabetes. Could this be caused by the DU? And I had no idea there was a link between radiation or depleted uranium and diabetes. So I started going around the world collecting vital health statistics from governments around the world. And I only use government data and military data because it cannot be challenged. And lo and behold, I discovered diabetes was extremely rare globally before 1945, and almost all children who got it died by the time they were 7. So it wasn't genetically passed on by children who had it. And the increase in pancreatic cancer in Japanese males between 1945 and 1965 increased like 12-fold in 20 years. And so then I began looking for other studies, peer-reviewed scientific studies and government data, and I discovered that large increases in diabetes were reported in Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors of the bombings, in Chernobyl victims, in people who lived around nuclear power plants and were exposed to fresh fission products. And then I started hearing that our own soldiers returning from Iraq have not only Gulf War syndrome, but they have diabetes too. And these are 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds who never had diabetes in their families, and they're coming back with it, horrible cancers all over their bodies within 6 months or a year or 2 years. And I said, I went to see the Manhattan Project scientist that I work with. He worked at the nuclear weapons lab in Livermore for 20 years. And he probably knows more about microbiology now than he does about nuclear weapons. And so we sat down and I showed him all the data and the rainfall map for Israel and the bar graph for the rainfall patterns. And in many studies in Finland, in the Marshall Islands, in Europe, in Sweden, in Israel, there was absolutely a direct correlation for new cases of diabetes reported during the highest period of rainfall. And so I've really absolutely confirmed it now with many, many sources and studies. And I went out to see Marion Folk in Livermore, the Manhattan Project scientist. We sat down. I said, here is all the data. And he listened for about 30 minutes, and then he said, Leuren, the only reason they're getting it within 2 months of exposure, it's not the radiation effect, and it's not the chemical heavy metal effect. It's the tiny particle effect, the particulate effect of nanoparticles. And these are biologically the worst toxin known to man.
Okay, could you just repeat for us, kind of summarize for us the actual manifestation diseases that come from exposure? We have cancer, we have birth defects, we have diabetes. What else? Chronic fatigue syndrome you mentioned? Yes,
neuromuscular diseases. The soldiers exposed in the Middle East, some of them come back in adult diapers.
Is that like ALS?
They lose control of their body functions.